All right, yesterday I made the illusion that we began in Sweden and then moved across. We ended up in China. And so I guess we're just going to keep our way moving around the globe. And Jorge Sebastio, he's been a colleague and friend for 15 years, one way or another. He knows the Mideast, which is certainly a component of where this whole thing is evolving and moving on. A couple of the comments that were made yesterday have been, I think Tim's still sitting here. He was talking about the Chinese view of cultural, understand the culture of your adversaries, ingratiate yourself into their mindsets, otherwise you're going to fail. Huge amount, and we've had some discussions, a number of us, about the cultural differences, cyber war in the Mideast. So with that, Jorge Sebastio, please.
Okay, first, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I do apologize yesterday for being taken by working on the presentation, so I did not have time too much to network with you, but I'll take advantage of the time today to expand on that. Maybe being a little bit of a perfectionist, I tend to rewrite my presentation about 20 times, so this is, although it's version 1.0, it should actually be like version 20 or something. So we're going to be spending about the next 45 minutes or so together. At the end, there'll be time for questions, or if you have questions as I go through, please feel free to interrupt me. And there'll be maybe a few 5 minutes or 10 that will do a bit of audio for some things that obviously we cannot always discuss on air. So in terms of the things that I would like to cover during this presentation, it involves things are changing, and we live in a new world order, and we have to understand the implications of this world order. The Middle East is a bit different than the rest of the world, and it's different culturally, it's different in how it approaches. It is evolving at a very fast pace electronically because it has invested quite substantially in its infrastructure. I remember when I landed in the Middle East over 20 years ago from Canada. At the time, I was working for Computer Associates, and I do remember well that we were actually supporting some customers by using fax technology. Today, when I drive between Bahrain and Riyadh, I can actually do a Skype call on 3 or 4G full video. So it has evolved tremendously. It's not a war of equals, so it's a highly asymmetrical war. The people in the Middle East are very creative and very resourceful, so although some maybe have very limited resources, they still are able to have very effective attacks against the infrastructures. And the Middle East is about tribes, tribal. So one has to understand that alliances change very fast, and the wind of change is on us in the Middle East. One other interesting aspect about the cyber war in the Middle East is that the boundaries between the cyber war, the war of the packets, as we can call it, and the physical war is interchangeable, where you actually don't see that in other cyber wars that's going through. And then some time for Q&A. So, what is this new world order? At the end of the day, one has expected that the new cyber warriors are really highly equipped with very advanced cyber weapons, where at the end we have very simple kids, sometimes 16 or 19 years old, that can cause as much disruption. On the other side, we have what we sometimes has been referred to as the acts of evil, creates new alliances that we actually need to defend ourselves against it. But the cartoon that I think highlights our business probably more than any other is, and I'm a fan of it, it's called Spy versus Spy, in the sense that we actually live in a connected world, and our job is never finished. So no matter how much we actually become at doing our jobs, the other guy becomes better, and if we stop doing better at what we are, we basically lose the battle right away. So it's really a race against time. And I'll put in a plug for Win at the end of the whole presentation. In terms of the Middle East, we can define it as the short Middle East or the wide Middle East. You know, there's countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, etc., UAE that can call the core of the Middle East being the GCC, but there's obviously Egypt, the MENA, which is Tunisia, Morocco, etc., the Maghreb. And then, of course, now countries like Turkey are part of the Middle East, and to some extent even Cyprus. But there's other countries that you do not necessarily may consider part of the Middle East, but they have alliances and participate in Middle East activities. Example would be Indonesia or Malaysia. One has to understand these alliances because they play an important part in these relationships. And other countries, like, for example, Afghanistan, Pakistan, or even India, get involved in Middle East activities all the time. The New World Order that is really taking it upon us is that we started primarily as a defensive approach towards cyber warfare, where today we look much more at an offensive capability. And I think when we start this offensive capability, one has to realize the implications of that, and I'll try to highlight this to the presentation as I go about. You can say today this primarily offensive capability exists in countries like the United States, France, China, Russia, and certainly Israel in the Middle East. But one would be surprised that countries with much less resources have also developed their own offensive capability. So what we have here is an evolution of cyber war capabilities, where we have at the top of the food chain the United States, China, and Russia. Not too far behind, we have certainly France, UK, and Israel. But other countries have evolved at a very fast pace. Countries, for example, like India, with a lot of IT resources. Turkey has played an important part, and certainly Iran is now almost, you can say, considered ranking number 4 in these capabilities. But other countries, although they're very quiet, one should not misunderstand their quietness for their capabilities or what is actually happening under the covers. That includes countries like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. So, many of these countries actually participate together. Some have different levels of capability, but also what we call national certs. They also have kind of a Islamic or Organization of Islamic Cooperation cert, which involves about 30 different countries that share common interests. The coordination of all these certs activities actually takes place in Oman. So today there is actually 3 primary certs that have playing key roles in the Middle East. One is certainly the Oman, which is not only for the country, but also the Islamic Cooperation cert. There is certainly UAE and Qatar certs have invested substantially and have more advanced capabilities. Other ones, for example, like Saudi Arabia, Iran, or for example, Turkey or Egypt, are more new in their capabilities. Or other 2 countries like Bahrain or Kuwait still have very embryonic certs. You know, they have not been fully deployed and do not yet participate in very large or wide activities. The reason why I mention here CERT is because CERT plays an important aspect in taking the defense capabilities. As I talk about the New World Order, another important aspect is the advancement of technology as we use it today. A few years ago, you can say mainframes, PCs, and by the way, I did work on punch cards when I started in my business. So you can say that today we have mobile devices. You got to hold it up to the light.
We can.
Amazing.
There we go.
And being able to read EBCDIC.
You're serious.
By the way, these are my business cards. You work already National Security Corporation.
So the world today has evolved into what we call mobile devices. So today, many of us perform all of our business activities on mobile devices. I do teach a 5-day course on mobile security, and one realizes very well that mobile devices are extremely different. Our entire lives are on it. They're more complex in their capabilities in the sense that they have GPS, Wi-Fi, 3G, 4G capabilities, location, camera, audio capabilities. So that gives the cyber war a whole new insight in how to attack our new infrastructure. To make matters worse, and I think this was presented by one of the early presenters yesterday, was what we call the Internet of Things. We decided to somehow put an IP on everything, from our running shoes to the things that we carry, our fridge. And so now our fridge can actually attack us, things that we did not thought possible. Other thing that has also certainly evolved is when we look at about state-sponsored attacks, is the amount of resources that are available. So there is much better capability to actually turn this Internet of Things as the point of attack into our, what do we call now, our critical infrastructure. So for many countries, what is really their critical infrastructure? Certainly their banking sector, their electrical grid, their water supply, and certainly water, more than oil, in many cases sometimes is a reason for war in the Middle East, because it's one of these resources that is in scarce availability. Transportation is becoming more and more critical. The interesting aspect about the infrastructure that we're trying to manage is that no matter what amount of protection that we put in place, whether it's firewalls, IDS, IPS, antivirus, data leakage protection, they're able to get in. And because they're able to get in, we have to look at how we defend ourselves in a completely different way. And I'll try to cover that towards the end of the presentation. So you have to assume, especially you live in today's world, is that your systems are compromised by default, and then you have to think that as the way to actually defend yourselves. So what are some things unique about the Middle East, and certainly what we can sometimes refer to as cyber jihad? There's blurring lines between ideology and the actual war, we sometimes call jihad, which means supporting a defense that is for a just cause. Sometimes they hack for money, and the purpose of this money is actually to fund their operations. What that really means is there is a complete circle that goes around between what we sometimes would call today financial crime now becomes part of a war crime, because the two are actually tied together. So one has to find a relationship between both. There's an intention of simply disruption critical infrastructure, and there's a few tools that get used for that on a time-to-time basis. And there's a race to develop their own generation of cyber weapons. These weapons can be used, for example, for encryption, for extracting information from devices, or for simply recording camera or keystrokes. And there's been a few examples of these tools that have been captured over the years and actually have been used for offensive purposes. Of course, there's a lack of skill in many areas, so the Middle East is spending a lot of time and effort towards developing experience, training, and recruiting. And of course, online is being used a lot to build alliances, and these alliances are quite dynamic. One of the things that the Middle East is very capable is that using social networks for their own advantage. So in that sense, and there's been a few examples of that, this being one of the most notable ones, the propaganda that can be distributed via the internet sometimes is as effective at destroying or disrupting the enemy as an actual cyber attack, which means that it's about the effectiveness of the weapon that matters, and sometimes that weapon is simply just information. As I mentioned, one of the important blurred lines is the line between cyber warfare and cyber crime. So now there is a little bit of connection between both, in the sense that cybercrime is actually being used to build large amounts of cash, and this large amount of cash is now being used to fund specific organizations that then go and conduct cyber warfare. So you have to be aware that in this new world, you need to actually, what I sometimes refer to as, connect the dots. So organizations like the Iranian Cyber Army are actually using botnets to collect money from credit cards to then go on and fund their own cyber war operations. So there is a dividing line there that is getting more and more blurred as we proceed. Many of us, of course, heard about the Operation Olympic Games and some of the aspects associated with it. One of the things for me it was surprising, certainly for the US, Israel, and a few other related countries, was somehow the admission of, in a public scenario, that those things actually existed. One always assumed what we call plausible deniability as the standard way to talk about it. And the reason why I found this important is that when your house is made out of glass, the last thing you want to do is throw a stone at your enemy, because the enemy has much less to lose than a country or an organization such as the United States or Israel. In some cases, some of these attacks were launched without proper weapons, in the sense that in the case of Duku or Flame, the code was not properly encrypted or not properly obfuscated, which means that the weapons that you use against your enemy could and were used against you in the future. So they reverse engineer the code and they repurpose the weapons to launch, you can say, a reverse attack. Certainly one of the statements that was made by Bruce Schneier is that he considered to some extent Stuxnet a mistake, or at least certainly the admission of Stuxnet as its existence. So you can say one of the key events of this century that caused an escalation was Stuxnet. I've done probably many presentations over the last 4 or 5 years on Stuxnet, and we don't need to spend a lot of time here on it. But certainly the important aspect is the sophistication of the amount of the attack that goes on, in the sense that the world of IT and the world of engineering came together to actually destroy and cause weapon. In the sense that in order to destroy the centrifuges, the amount of research that was done, including items like resonance. And resonance is nothing to do with the work in you I do every day. This is the work of pure engineering, to determine what is the frequency that you need to use to actually destroy a given object. I mean, make it shake it to the point that that object actually self-destructs. So if you're interested, maybe after the presentation I can show you some of the videos of resonance and how they can actually be used to create a substantial destructive impact. As a subsequent to Stuxnet, there was other attacks that were also focused on the Middle East, like Flame. One important aspect about these two attacks certainly is that both of them were on for 2 to 3 years before they were actually discovered. And this again highlights the point that I want to finalize later on, is that the importance of time in our capability of self-defense. So if it takes you 2 to 3 years to find out that you actually were attacked, by that time it's too little, too late. So time plays a very important aspect. Other attack was Flame, which was used for espionage, sabotage. It was a very large and highly modular. Interestingly enough, here the code was not properly encrypted, so the same weapon could easily be repurposed for attacking the original attacker as well. You can see that the infections that actually took place for Duku, Flame, and Gauss spread quite well across the Middle East. One interesting aspect about certainly these attacks compared to Stuxnet is that they were much more quiet in how they approached the attack, in the sense that they propagated very slowly to evade as much detection as possible. One of the notable attacks, certainly of last year, or certainly late 2012, was the Shamu attack that was on Saudi Aramco and Ras Gas. This actually was, you can call it an holiday gift, because this attack was actually designed to take place on the first day of Eid holidays. So the day that the Saudi Aramco employees are actually scheduled to go on vacation. This attack invaded 32,000 machines, where it destroyed the boot sector and made the information in these machines basically unusable. The downtime in Saudi Aramco was mostly on the administrative systems, although the impact was quite substantial, where in RasGas, actually the downtime involved oil or gas production. Now, the attack could have been much worse in the sense of the Saudi Aramco. Of course, the oil facilities are actually done not using a Windows system, but using a Unix system, so they're completely isolated. Actually, Saudi Aramco is about 7 different organizations that use different technologies. But this specific piece of code only worked well in 32-bit systems, not well in 64-bit. So the actual virus crashed in 64-bit machines. So if the attack would have been properly tested, they would have destroyed much more of Saudi Aramco facilities than it actually did. At the time of the attack, also Saudi Aramco invited experts from the outside to come and help them. The experts actually made the job even worse, and the thing kept progressing. The attackers had the administration password of all the machines that they were attacking. So now you can imagine now the job of recovering this environment. You literally have 32,000 hard disks where the information is still there, but to get it back, you need to recover it the hard way, disk, by doing a complete sweep of the disk. So it's a good job for the next 2 or 3 years. Now, what does this actually mean in the day-to-day operations of Saudi Aramco? Let's assume I'm a Saudi Aramco doctor, because there is actually an hospital in Saudi Aramco. That means if you're a patient and you're coming to me, I will go to you, what was the reason why you came visit me last time? I don't remember, I don't have the records to actually be able to serve you. So this is the actual impact, and there's other impacts that we can certainly talk about towards the end of the presentation. But it was substantial in terms of the operations of the organization. But as I mentioned before, the oil production directly was not impacted at all.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Just 2 questions. That's really interesting. You did say 2 weeks downtime for RAS gas. Is that administrative as well?
No, that was actually gas production.
Oh, really?
Yes. RAS gas were actually down in the production, where the systems in Saudi Aramco for oil are actually isolated. There is something called XSpec and OSPAS. One is for exploration. The other one is actually to put the oil on the boats. And those systems are actually using Unix-based systems. This was not a Windows-based attack, so they would not have the capability to propagate into those systems.
And you also said that the forensic work would exacerbated the problem. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Correct. Actually, what happened is there was a tech team for security company that shall name nameless. They arrived and they tried to fix the thing, but the thing was designed to actually make matters worse when you played with it. So as they tried to fix it, they actually the blue screens actually started to appear much worse.
Being in London, picked up some contract requests about that time. Some of those were coordinated by the UK diplomatically. One of the biggest worries was one of the main people in the US, and I won't name them for the moment, but take me offline if you want them. They actually bypassed the best people they had in the first instance, which was surprising.
Yes, actually, this highlights a very important aspect about incident response. You have to test your incident response before the attack, not during the attack. When you are trying to test incident response during an attack, it's kind of the best way to maybe describe it in simple terms is if you have never gone to the gym, the first time you go to the gym and you pick up that bell, it's going to hurt a little bit. So that's probably describes it very closely. There's more I can describe, but that we'll have to discuss during a coffee time.
The 32,000 machines, were those all physically within Saudi, or was that global?
No, well, there was a few global, but 99% were actually in Saudi Aramco. There's a place called Bahrain, which actually is a city. Actually, Aramco is like a country in a country to some extent. So it was inside the Aramco facility. Aramco's got something like 50 or 75,000 employees, so it's a fairly large organization.
All on one campus or distributed?
They're distributed. They even have employees in Texas here, so they have quite a few organizations around the world. But you can say the bulk of the employees are in Bahrain. But of course, they have exploration all the way around the country. So they have people on the ground throughout the entire country. Now, this type of attacks obviously keeps going beyond just the Shama. I just give you as an example. So Palestinian and others tend to attack Israel on a regular basis. So when they get attacked, Israel also kind of responds by attacking back Saudis, Egyptians, and Syrians. Now, most of these attacks tend to be of a denial of service nature or just informational. So no critical infrastructure systems other than banking tend to be disrupted. One interesting aspect, as I mentioned before, is the Middle East is slowly developing their own capabilities of cyber weapons. And certainly Mahdi is one example of that. And it's a Trojan that was designed and developed in the Middle East, and basically has the capability of attack, record keystrokes, turn on the audio on your machines, steal text and image files. And you can quickly see by who was mostly affected by this virus, in this case Israel, to 72%, who was really the target audience for this particular virus. Other important aspect certainly is we tend to not always protect our infrastructure very adequately. And one example is America certainly uses a lot of what we call drone technology to conduct normal warfare. So in two particular cases, a Predator, Reaper, and actually one of the drones was actually captured by Iran. So the first case, a keylogger virus was actually affecting the software of the drones. On the second case, they actually were able to analyze and decompile the contents of the drone itself. The little pink drone you see there, that was a gift from Iran to President Obama, kind of. I shall not say more. From time to time, the financial infrastructure is critically important. So here is an example of a Middle East attack that caused substantial amount of disruption on the US banks. One important aspect I always like to highlight about certainly distributed denial of service attacks is here we have attacks that are being conducted by countries that have substantially less bandwidth capability, but however they use creativity to actually still being able to launch fairly attacks that cause major disruption. The best way to describe it for you is they're breathing through a straw, but they can still make you have a sweat at the same time, in simple terms. Iran continues to develop their capability in very sophisticated ways. Here is a list of the teams that launched the majority of the attacks during July. This is actually 2013, not 2014, because we're not there yet. And this was Iran attack against specific countries. Now, one of the things that I like to mention as well, as I was talking to you earlier, is the blurred lines between the cyber world and the real world kind of meet the where the rubber hits the road in the Middle East. So they have developed, you can say, the fourth largest cyber army today. Their objective is primarily to protect their critical infrastructure, create isolated networks for that infrastructure, and also develop attack capability. But being the head of a cyber army in Iran is also a dangerous job. So in this case, this person actually got killed. So this is where, so for example, I don't know many of you, if you're head of a cyber army, you don't feel yourself being at risk of being head of that cyber army. Yes, please, go ahead.
On the previous slides where you had the graph of the different units there or groups, are those endorsed by the state, or they're just individuals that happen to be supporting Iranian interests, or how would you categorize those groups? It's
actually a combination of both. There's a percentage of those that are actually just volunteers, but in the case of the Iranian cyber army, they have the actual army, and then they have groups that they sponsor and they train and they give resources to. So it's a combination of both. Another interesting group that has been is what we call the SEA, or the Syrian Electronic Army. They have launched attacks against the banks in the USA, denial of service attacks. They have launched attacks against Turkey, headed by a 19-year-old guy. So here's a country that is at war, very limited resources, but still is capable to launch sophisticated attacks. Vice magazine actually tried to list through an interview some of the names of this electronic army, and basically the result was that they were themselves attacked as well. So the Vice website got taken down a few times by the SEA. One would expect a country like Israel, which has been in a tough situation for many years, has developed very sophisticated capability of defending itself, But even a country such as Israel that has that capability gets attacked from time to time. Denial of service attacks, web defacement attacks. And the enemies have become at creating attacks that actually pass under the radar. And there's certainly two recent attacks that should be highlighted. One is the attack against the CCTV system that controls a busy highway. So this highway had to be shut down for 8 hours because the system was not operational. And the second one is at the water processing plant in Haifa. As I mentioned before, water is one of the resources that actually is in big demand in the Middle East. So if you attack the water capabilities of a country, they lose the capacity to actually operate under such environments. On the outliers of all of this, there's even countries that one would not expect to have cyber capabilities somehow still manage to appear in the news. Somalia is a country that one would not expect, but they're able to use the social networks to actually drive their message across. And one example was the attack that actually happened in the Kenya supermarket, this shopping center. I visited this shopping center myself probably more than 20 times during a few of the implementations, but it just shows you that they're able to even themselves create a little bit of noise. I mentioned the alliances go beyond the Middle East. Indonesia last year came briefly for a period of time the world's largest source of cyber attacks. So this is a country that one would not expect to actually be in the news, certainly in the capabilities of the cyber attacks. But they have and are slowly developing capability. I also mentioned that the cyber world meets the real world. It not only meets the real world when one attacks the head of a cyber army, but also meets the real world when cable cuts happen. And in this case, during a period a few years ago, 5 cable cuts actually happened almost simultaneously. I don't know if you know what is 5 cable cuts happening at such short period of time. It's probably the equivalent of being struck by lightning about 3 or 4 times. So one can quickly expect.
Would that have been to the detriment of Iran, or would it have been in their favour?
Actually, both. It was to the detriment of Iran because it's actually designed to isolate it and completely cut it off in terms of internet. However, it allowed Iran to actually develop further their capabilities. You have to understand, there's always this famous expression, what does not kill you makes you stronger. So please always be aware that there's 2 sides to every coin. Other important aspects, there's ongoing attacks, and this little flowchart kind of shows that, Iran attacks Israel, Israel attacks Iran, Palestinian attacks Israel, Israel attacks Palestine or Saudi Arabia, and vice versa. So there's always an ongoing tit-for-tat of these small, what we call cyber skirmishes that happen, minor DDoSs, defacements, private disclosures. So for example, if you're an important guy, the chance that your email or your private phone number gets disclosed, or things like attacks against the financial sector. To finalize the end of, or wrapping up my presentation, certainly one area that seems to be on the growth is these denial of service attacks. And what we have seen is that the capacity of these attacks is growing in the neighborhood of 60 to 100 gigabits per second. So this is the kind of sustained attacks that you need to be able to defend yourself in an effective way. One interesting aspect is who should we keep our eyes on as we move forward? And I always like to make the parallel between the physical world and the cyber world. So today the United States certainly spends a lot in their military spending and in their cyber spending as well. But some other countries in the Middle East that you should keep an eye on for cyber weapons certainly is Israel. In the US, they have already developed them. But other countries such as Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, and India. And by the way, one interesting aspect about Pakistan, if you still do not remember, although it's a poor country, but they're very creative people, they actually created the first virus, if you remember, the Pakistani virus. Not only that, the Pakistani virus actually contained the phone numbers of the individuals who created that virus. And if you go to the door and you ring that phone, the guys are actually still happy to receive you in their house and welcome you for coffee. So the Middle East is definitely a unique place to work in. So 18 critical infrastructure sectors that were highlighted by the US. So when we look about protecting or defending in the cyber warfare world, this is really where you need to defend yourselves. Banking, water supplies, critical infrastructure such as nuclear plants. The Middle East is building a lot of these because they see that the oil eventually will run out. Protect your water supplies, protecting your bank financial sector, etc. So what kind of message do I want to leave with you as I finish my presentation? One is that in order for us to defend ourselves properly against these type of attacks, we have to kind of think a little bit outside the box. So the traditional methods that we continue to use are simply not effective, or we always need to keep updating, or what I call our assumptions. They always seem to be a little bit misplaced. The other important aspect is that the attackers of the Middle East are actually extremely creative. Let me give you one example. We all know about the NSA and their famous cyber espionage capabilities. But do you know that a country like Pakistan with very limited capabilities is actually capable of bypassing this sophisticated technology with a simple programmer that costs no more than $1,000 a month? They discovered a few years ago, and this was because it wasn't the guy's laptop, that some of the attackers in Pakistan had created a small piece of code that is capable of, when they want to send a message, they take a message that you want to send, it splits that message into different chunks, and actually sends this message using different channels and different encryption mechanisms and different protocols and different tools. What that really means is that if you're an organization like the NSA and doing this massive data globbing, you will never be able to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. And so it means billions of dollars being invested, and $1,000 of investment is capable to completely bypass this approach. This is what I call creativity. So that means if you want to defend yourselves against this $1,000 investment, you have to start thinking in a different way in order to actually be effective. To finalize as well, our job is really about risk management. So at the end of the day, we have limited resources, so we need to really do a proper risk assessment to actually delegate our resources to where we have the greatest impact and where we have the greatest exposure so that we get the most bang for the buck. And to finalize, I mentioned before the most important resource that we do not have in the cyber warfare world is time. And I always like being a mathematician by nature. I always like this equation, even today. P must be greater than D plus R, which means the level of protection that you have, or the tools that you dedicate to protection, should be greater or buy you more time than detection and response. In the cyber war world of today, you have to assume that you have zero-day attacks. So that means protection equals zero. That really means the things that you need to focus on is detection and response. That means if it takes you 2 to 3 years to figure out that you're being attacked, like in the case of Stuxnet, Duku, Flame, etc., that means they come, they go, it's too late. In the case of Shamu, response was extremely important. So you have to try your incident response scenarios much way ahead of time in order to be effective in your approach to defend yourselves. So if you want to be in this business, the most important aspect is what I call agility. So this is probably my famous motto. I'm a bomb technician. If you see me running, try to keep up. So, yes, please, there were some questions.
So, based on what you just said about the current response or defensive paradigm,
Speak up, please.
would you advocate that an active cyber posture for defensive purposes, or even a preemptive one?
Well, I would not go so far as a preemptive one today, but certainly you have to go beyond defensive capabilities to be effective today. But I think even more important than that, the traditional ways of collecting cyber intelligence, we think they're effective, but in reality they are not for the most creative people. Next question, please.
I noticed you did mention several of the contract capabilities that are kind of proliferating in the Gulf, like Hack Team. These guys you're providing. I'm not thinking of the other names, but there's several organizations, mostly out of Europe, that are providing capabilities to some of the regimes there. Have you looked at any of those guys? Or?
Yes, but as I mentioned during my presentation, not everything can be addressed.
Yeah, I guess my question is, how do you think that? Do you think there's going to be more of that, or are proliferating through?
No, of course, that will continue because at the end of the day is what we call cyber for hire. So there's going to be a lot more of these mercenary kind of approach towards. So the mercenaries of the real world have simply moved into the cyber world, nothing more, nothing less.
Can you address a little bit more about the NGOs, the really bad guys, whether it's the hiding, the attacking, the obfuscation? Because most of this was focused on what I'm gathering to be nation-state oriented.
See, the NGOs, what happens, most of the local countries see them sometimes as a Trojan horse, so they do not necessarily trust NGOs at all, and they try to either isolate them or keep them as much far away from mainstream as possible because they see NGOs primarily as an instrument of foreign powers.
I think one of the real asymmetries there on the NGOs is that
you might be referring to different NGOs.
a lot of the potential targets of these organizations, if you will, governments, more major corporations like Aramco, et cetera, are highly dependent upon their IT infrastructure for their proper functionality. And yet some of these attackers are not. Rather, they tend to live in either individual or small cells. The computing systems are basically weaponized rather than used for command and control and operating their own organization because you don't really have a profit center to go ahead and maintain. You had mentioned for $1,000 a month, you can go ahead and develop offensive capabilities or even defensive capabilities. You don't need to do much, so your attack surface as the attacker is virtually zero, other than the meat space attack surface where you go ahead and you have to put pop around into the head of somebody or other, and now all of a sudden the only way to stop the cyber attack is to go after the humans.
That is correct. So there is this merge of the cyber and physical world, but the other thing is very important is that we have Goliath and the small able guy with the slingshot, but the guy with the slingshot can be almost as effective as the Goliath guy, and the cyber world certainly proves that. And by the way, this is no different than the way it happens in the real cyber world, when a small organization, by promoting their products to Google, can effectively compete with a much larger organization that has a much deeper pockets. So you can say that the cyber world kind of levels the playing field a little bit. So you have to go back to square one to actually be more effective.
So project this out 5 or 10 years. Do you see a GCC-specific network that's going to be excluding others, or do you see a balkanization, or is it going to be?
Well, that is already work in progress. Actually, Saudi Arabia has the intent of unifying the GCC, not just the cyber armies, but the real armies as well. But see, the problem with the GCC is that the dynamics of the GCC change on a day-by-day basis. Example from the last discussions, Oman does not want to participate in that alliance 100% yet, so it's kind of a tough way forward. One simple example, the GCC has been trying to unify their monetary union now for almost 15, 20 years, and still they have not, it's still ongoing discussions, so you can say that it will take a lot more negotiations for this to actually take place. So either it will happen maybe by forceful means, or the ongoing negotiations will continue.